Good morning. I am Devasena. In this lecture, we are going to discuss about human nervous system. This topic is present in the subject medical electronics. Human nervous system. Human nervous system, the part of the human body that coordinates a person's voluntary and involuntary actions and transmits signals between different parts of the body. This human nervous system consists of two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. This is the representation of the human nervous system. The nervous system takes in information through our senses, processes the information and triggers reactions such as making our muscles move or causing us to feel pain. The central nervous system includes nerves in the brain and spinal cord. Functionally, the nervous system has two main subdivisions, the somatic or voluntary component and the autonomic or involuntary component. The autonomic nervous system regulates certain body processes such as blood pressure and the rate of breathing that work without conscious effort. The somatic system consists of nerves that connect the brain and spinal cord with muscles and sensory receptors in the skin. Let us see nerves. Nerves are cylindrical bundles of fibers that start at the brain and central cord and branch out to every other part of the body. Neurons send signals to other cells through thin fibers called axons, which cause chemicals known as neurotransmitters to be released at junctions called synapses. There are over 100 trillion neural connections in the average human brain, though the number and location can vary. Let us see how transmission happens in neuron. Information from all parts of the body is carried in the form of action potentials. That information is passed to the brain with the help of the neuron. This representation shows how neuron transmission takes place. Here we are having so many neurons. The information is being passed to the nearby neurons. This is focused here. Let us see how neuron connections takes place through dendrite. This is the representation. Here we are having two neurons. These two neurons are connected through the dendrite. The cross-sectional view of the dendrite is shown here. Inside the dendrite we are having cells. The representation. Let's start discussing about the overview of brain. Protected within the skull, the brain is composed of cerebrum, cerebellum and brainstem. The brain controls our thoughts, memory and speech. movement of the arms and legs, and the function of many organs within our body. The central nervous system, also known as CNS, is composed of the brain and spinal cord. Parts of the brain. The brain consists of the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. It controls most of the activities of the body, processing, integrating, and coordinating the information it receives from the sense organs and making decisions as to the instructions sent to the rest of the body. The brain is contained in and protected by the skull bones of the head. Let us see the function of the skull. The human skull is the bony structure that forms the head in the human skeleton. This is the representation of the human skull. Inside the skull, the human brain is placed. It supports the structures of the face and forms a cavity for the brain. Like the skull of other vertebrates, it protects the brain from injury. Identification of cerebrum, cerebellum, medulla in the brain. This is the representation of the brain. It comprises of cerebrum, cerebellum, and medulla. Let us see the cerebrum. Cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is composed of right and left hemispheres. It performs higher functions like interpreting touch, vision, and hearing, as well as speech, reasoning, emotions, learning, and fine control of movement. Cerebellum is located under the cerebrum. Cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the largest site of neural integration in the central nervous system. It plays a key role in attention, perception, awareness, thought, memory, language, and consciousness. This is the representation of the cerebral cortex. Let us see about corpus callosum. Corpus callosum consists of about 200 million axons that interconnect the two hemispheres. The primary function of the corpus callosum is to integrate motor, sensory, and cognitive performance between the cerebral cortex on one side of the brain to the same region on the other side. This is the representation of the corpus callosum. Let us see two hemispheres in brain. Left hemisphere and right hemisphere. The right hemisphere performs innovating, initializing, supporting, coordinating. Similarly, the functions performed by left hemispheres are evaluating, finishing, delivering, and focusing. Lobes in brain. This is the representation of the lobes. It comprises of frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. This is indicated here. Function of frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain that controls important cognitive skills in humans such as emotional expression, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, and sexual behaviors. It is, in essence, the control panel of our personality and our ability to communicate. This is the representation of the frontal lobe. Let us see the function of parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is at the back of the brain and is divided into two hemispheres. It functions in processing sensory information regarding the location of parts of the body as well as interpreting visual information and processing language and mathematics. This is the representation of the parietal lobe. The pink color portion indicates the parietal lobe. It interprets sensory information. Another representation here, the sensory organs collect the information and it passes those informations to the parietal lobe, and the parietal lobe analyzes the information received from the sensory organs and appropriately it takes the decisions. This is represented here. Let us see the function of temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is involved in primary auditory perception such as hearing and holds the primary auditory cortex. This is the representation of the temporal lobe. The primary auditory cortex receives sensory information from the ears, and secondary areas process the information into meaningful units such as speech and words. This function is done by the temporal lobe. Function of occipital lobe. The occipital lobe participates in vision processing. It processes and interprets everything we see. The occipital lobe is also responsible for analyzing contents such as shapes, colors, and movement, and also for interpreting and drawing conclusions about the images we see. This is the representation of the occipital lobe. The information from the eyes is passed to the occipital lobe through the optic nerve. It controls vision and recognition, that is visual perception, color recognition, receives visual input from retina. Retina is part of brain. Visual signals are interpreted in occipital lobes through the optic nerves. Each optic nerve has million fibers. Lobes and overview. This is the representation of the four lobes. Frontal lobe. Options are weighed by logic and modification. Temporal lobe. Emotions are stored and decisions are made. Occipital lobe. Images and colors visually processed. Parietal. Information processed. Let's see about meninges, the representation. Meninges comprises of arsinoid, durameter and piometer. The cerebrospinal fluid is indicated here. Function of cerebellum. The cerebellum receives information from the sensory systems, the spinal cord and the other parts of the brain, and then regulates motor movements. The cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements such as posture, balance, coordination and speech, resulting in smooth and balanced muscular activity. Location of cerebellum in brain. The cerebellum is located under the cerebrum. It is indicated here. Let us see the function of the medulla. The medulla oblongata, or simply medulla, is a long stem-like structure which makes up part of the brain stem. This is the representation of the medulla. It is anterior and partially inferior to the cerebellum. It is a cone-shaped neuronal mass responsible for autonomic, that is involuntary, autonomic functions ranging from vomiting to sneezing. Let's see the function of spinal cord. The spinal cord is a long, thin, tubular structure made up of nervous tissue which extends from the medulla oblongata in the brainstem to the lumbar region of the vertebral column. It includes the central canal of the spinal cord, which contains cerebrospinal fluid. The brain and the spinal cord together make up the central nervous system. In humans, the spinal cord begins at the occipital bone, passing through the foramen magnum and entering the spinal canal at the beginning of the cervical vertebrae. Let us see function of cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. CSF has several functions in the nervous system. It protects the brain during blood pressure fluctuations, regulates the chemical environment of the central nervous system, and it is a vehicle for intracerebral transport. So this is the representation of the cerebrospinal fluid. Between the inner two layers is a clear fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which absorbs shock, transfers nutrients to the brain, removes waste from the brain. This is represented here. Circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. CSF is formed within the ventricles by small delicate tufts of specialized tissue called the choroid plexus. From the fourth ventricle, it passes through three small openings into the subarachnoid space surrounding the brain and spinal cord. This is the representation of the cerebrospinal fluid. So far we have discussed about the overview of nervous system. Thank you very much for listening this lecture. If you like this video, means you can share this video to your friends. For further updates, kindly subscribe this channel. Once again, thank you.